You might think you know exactly what Israel or Jew means, especially when we're talking about ancient history. It often feels pretty straightforward, right? Set in stone.
Yeah, it really does seem that way sometimes.
But what if we told you that those identities and, the words themselves were actually far more fluid, more debated, and way more complex than you've ever imagined?
That's absolutely right. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a really fascinating collection of sources. We've got scholarly articles, historical research, ancient texts.
The real mix.
Yeah, to uncover how the very concept of Israel has been, well, passionately debated, redefined, and reimagined for millennia.
And our mission here is to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge from all this rich material. Basically, give you a shortcut to being truly well-informed on a topic that shaped history and honestly still resonates so powerfully today.
Definitely. Expect some surprising facts and insights, things that might really shift your perspective.
Okay, so let's unpack this incredible fluidity of identity, starting with those core terms, Israel, Judah, and the Jew.
Right.
Because the very boundaries of Israel have been contested territory basically ever since the Israelite monarchies faded out. It's never been simple.
Exactly. And recent scholarship, particularly, new discoveries about the Samaritans, has really pushed us to reevaluate some long-held assumptions.
Okay.
Scholar Steve Mason even says Israel is, quote, a term that merits further exploration across the board. It's just much more nuanced than we might think at first glance.
And this is where, for me, it gets really interesting. In this ancient period, there's actually, well, no evidence to support distinguishing between the ethnic and religious aspects of Israel or Jewishness.
That's a key point.
The ancient languages themselves simply didn't have separate words for the ethnic, cultural, geographical, or religious sides of being, say, Iudaios or Yehudi.
Right. So trying to use a modern term like Judean to artificially limit the meaning geographically, it's anachronistic, really. It just doesn't fit the period.
And going to lead to misunderstandings.
Oh, absolutely. Serious ones. Scholar Cynthia Baker concludes that while Judean might seem like it clarifies things, its ability to clarify is matched only by its potential for obfuscation and misrepresentation.
Wow. So our neat modern boxes just don't work.
Pretty much. The big revelation here is that our modern sort of rigid categories of ethnicity and religion, they just didn't exist for them in quite the same way.
That's a really crucial distinction. It forces us to, rethink how we approach ancient identity entirely.
It does.
Now, let's talk about how these terms were actually used. There's this influential scholar, Carl Georg Kuhn, who developed something called the inside-outsider model.
Kuhn's model.
He suggested that Yehudim was how the people referred to themselves, the insider term, you could say.
Right, their self-designation.
But Iudios was often used by non-Jews, the outsider term.
Yes, and then the term Israel generally carried a more profound religious weight. It highlighted that idea of God's chosen people.
So different terms for different contexts, almost.
Kind of. So texts from what's often called Palestinian Judaism tended to prefer Israel. They'd only really use Iudaios when they were, say, interacting with outsiders or maybe in diplomatic contexts.
Okay.
And even Hellenistic Jews living in the wider Greek-speaking world who were maybe more accustomed to Iudaios in just everyday speech, they still reached for Israel in their prayers. Why? Because of its deep scriptural connections.
Ah, that makes perfect sense. And this model, it really explains why terms like Iudaios pop up so often in texts like Philo, Josephus, Acts, the Gospel of John.
Because they were often writing
For non-Jewish audiences, exactly. Addressing outsiders. Now, we do need to pause for a moment regarding Carl Georg Kuhn himself. It's important context.
Yes, it is.
While his work was influential, particularly for its, scholarly sophistication and how it used Jewish texts, he also produced overtly anti-Semitic work during the Nazi era.
That's a critical piece of context, and we need to be clear. Our purpose here is to understand the historical scholarship and its impact, its ideas, not to endorse his personal views or later politics.
Absolutely not.
The source material we're looking at explicitly notes his anti-Semitism lay mainly in its skewed, caricatured representation of rabbinic Judaism. And importantly, he did later renounce that anti-Semitic publication.
Right. So we acknowledge this difficult history as part of the record, but we focus on the scholarly model itself and its influence.
Precisely. It's about understanding the history of these ideas.
Okay, so moving on to another piece in this linguistic puzzle. The term Hebrew.
Epros in the Greek.
Right. A thorough review of the evidence shows that before, say, the 2nd century CE, the primary meaning of Hebrew was basically linguistic,
Yeah.
purely about language.
Yeah. It referred either to the ancient biblical Hebrews who were just assumed to speak Hebrew, or maybe Aramaic, or to contemporary people who spoke a Semitic language.
So Hebraioi, that term is likely older and tied more to language.
That seems to be the case, whereas Iodeos came along later, likely after the Babylonian exile.
And what about those who kept speaking Hebrew, especially outside Judea in the diaspora?
Well, they were often seen as being especially traditional or conservative towards their heritage. So the language itself became this powerful marker, didn't it?
Yeah, a marker of identity, of commitment to tradition.
Exactly.
This all raises a really important question, though. Why do these terms and all their subtle nuances matter so much?
Well, it really all comes down to the power of shared narratives, foundational stories.
They're not just stories.
No, they're crucial. They don't just shape communities. They provide the very conceptual framework and vocabulary for any discourse among those who share that common mythos, the shared understanding.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about contemporary internet culture for a second. It's famously intertextual and meta-referential.
Meaning it's always referencing itself. Memes, quotes.
Exactly. It's constantly echoing and referencing its own canonical material, memes, movie lines, song lyrics, whatever. If you don't know the source, you totally miss the deeper meaning.
Right.
You're outside the joke.
Right, you're lost.
Well, ancient debates over Israel's heritage worked the exact same way. People were fluently appropriating and reshaping phrases, concepts, and narrative elements from the biblically dominated narrative world. They were constantly remixing their core stories.
So they were building on this shared library of stories and ideas.
Precisely. Wolfgang Funk called this a reconstructive function. They were constantly renegotiating and reshaping their discourse, their collective story, their narrative world. It's fundamental to how groups build and maintain their identity, their memory.
So thinking about that broader narrative world, what's fascinating is how often scholarship seems to have overlooked Josephus's perspective. His view that the Jews are actually a subset of Israel, not completely identical with it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, this long-standing assumption that Jew and Israelite are just interchangeable terms.
It led to what scholars call theory-induced blindness.
Exactly. It literally stopped people from seeing the bigger, more inclusive picture that Josephus, at least, seems to have been painting. It's not just semantics. It fundamentally shows how we understand the scope of Israelite identity back then.
Okay, so if Israel is bigger than just Jews, who else fits in? A prime example seems to be the Samaritans.
Absolutely. The Samaritans are key here.
The post-exilic Samaritans, they weren't just a new group appearing from nowhere, right?
Not at all. They were likely made up of the remnant of Israelites plus other indigenous peoples who stayed in the land after the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom back in the 8th century BCE. They had deep roots in that area.
And the evidence backs this up.
Oh, yeah. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence, inscriptions, and artifacts clearly show continuous worship of Yahweh, the God of Israel, in Samaria from the 9th all the way to the 5th century BCE.
Wow, that's a long time.
It is. And they had a cult center, a place of worship on Mount Gerizim from at least the mid-5th century BCE. This tells us Samaritan Yahwism wasn't just some, later copy of Judaism.
It was its own thing.
It was its own continuation of an earlier Israelite legacy. It had its own history.
So scholar Ferdinand Dexinger, looking at similarities with the Dead Sea Scrolls from Qumran, he concluded what?
He basically concluded that the Samaritans were effectively a Jewish group of the pluriform Judaism of that age.
Pluriform Judaism,
Yeah.
meaning lots of different ways to be Jewish back then.
Exactly. Many expressions, many groups, and they only really got labeled distinctly as Samaritans later on, after, as Dexinger puts it, the overstressing of separating doctrines, like the big debate over whether Mount Gerizim or Jerusalem was the true holy place.
And attempts to unite the northern group with the southern returnees, they failed.
Ultimately, yes, they proved unsustainable, especially after the Jewish leader John Hyrcanus. I destroyed the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim. That was a major breaking point.
But what's striking is
Both groups, Samaritans and Jews, continued to strongly, passionately claim to be Israelites. That identity was vital to both.
and if you look at the Hebrew Bible itself, even though it's largely edited from a southern Judahite perspective,
It still consistently constructs a biblical Israel larger than the Jews alone. That vision is embedded in the text.
James Linville asks a great question about this. Why, he asks, did the dialogue center on an Israelite heritage in the first place, and not simply a Judean one?
It's a fantastic question, because the texts themselves seem to insist on this bigger picture. The vision for Israel was always broader than just one tribe or one region.
And the genealogies in the Bible reinforce this.
Consistently, they weave northern Israelites and southern Judahites together as subsets of this larger 12-tribe body of Israel. It's a constant theme.
You also mentioned the Joseph story in Genesis. How does that fit?
Well, the prominence of Joseph gives us an early hint, maybe, of this concern for the northern house of Israel. Joseph being the ancestor of key northern tribes like Ephraim and Manasseh.
Okay.
And the story itself, Joseph seems lost, maybe even dead, living in a kind of exile, right? But then he's reunited with his brothers, and it leads to the salvation of all Israel.
So it works as a kind of symbol, a typology.
Exactly. It typologically parallels the northern tribes scattered among the nations. The implication is profound. Even though the northern tribes seemed dead or lost to history.
They weren't forgotten in this story.
Right. The narrative suggests they would eventually be revealed and restored at the salvation and reconstitution of all Israel. It keeps that hope alive.
Okay, and just briefly on a related note about origins, there are theories like the Khazar theory.
Ah, yes. Bruce Molina's Khazar theory, suggesting a different origin for Ashkenazi Jewish populations.
What's the scholarly view on that now?
Well, the source material we're drawing on is very clear here. It states this theory has been repeatedly discredited by genetic studies. Full stop.
So, not supported by evidence.
Therefore, any scholarly model based on it is not only to be rejected but repudiated. We just note that for the record.
Got it. So this broader, often contested idea of Israel brings us to another huge theme: the legacy of exile and the powerful vision of restoration.
Absolutely central. The Assyrian destruction of the north, then the Babylonian devastation of Judah. It led to exile, scattering, profound trauma.
Yeah, but even amidst failures, like King Hezekiah not fully uniting Israel, the chronicler, one of the biblical writers,
he still highlights the continued incompleteness of Israel. He acknowledges the fractured reality.
but there's hope.
Yes, but importantly, expresses hope for amendment, for healing through reform. It's this pattern. Loss, fragmentation, but also this persistent longing for wholeness, for a restored future.
And the prophet Jeremiah, living through this, he offered something quite radical, didn't he?
He really did. The beginnings of an ethic for living and serving YHWH as a minority group outside the land. That was revolutionary.
Oh, so he called the exiles the good figs.
Yes. Dramatically described those already in exile as the good figs and those left behind in Judah as the bad figs, a total reversal of expectations.
And his advice.
He told the exiles to settle down and prosper in the land of captivity, and crucially, seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile. For in its welfare you will find your welfare.
Wow. So bloom where you're planted, essentially.
Pretty much. The insight here was truly profound. Those outside the land were in no way inferior to those in the land. You could be faithful, serve God, thrive, even far from the homeland.
Then there's Ezekiel's vision, the 2 sticks.
Oh, a very dramatic vision. He describes taking 2 sticks. One represents Judah and for the sons of Israel associated with it. The other is for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and all the house of Israel associated with them.
Representing the southern and northern part.
Exactly. And then God tells him to join them into one stick so that they become one in your hand, a powerful symbol of reunification.
And importantly, they're joined within Israel.
Yes, that's key. It's not Israel versus Judah. It's Joseph and Judah within a restored Israel. The vision even includes what looks like the first reference to resurrection in Israelite literature, and instructions to divide the future restored land among the aliens who stay among you. It's an incredibly expansive vision: reunification, resurrection, even inclusion of outsiders.
So the whole theological outlook that developed during and after exile, it seems to have 2 core elements.
That's right. First, a continuity with the past covenantal relationship with Israel's God, holding on to that history, that unique bond.
And
Second, a hopeful expectation of the ultimate restoration of Israel, never letting go of that future hope.
So the main texts, the foundational stories,
They constantly confronted their audience with constant reminders of the present incompleteness of Israel, the fractured reality, but also instilled future hopes of a full restoration.
Jacob Neusner called this the core narrative.
He called it that story of exile and return, alienation and remission, the paradigmatic statement in which every Judaism from then to now found its structure and deep syntax of social existence. Basically, this cycle of loss, longing, hope, it became the fundamental blueprint for Jewish identity for millennia.
Yet, when we get to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which describe the actual return from Babylon, it's not quite the perfect fulfillment, is it?
No, it's much more complex. The book actually notes the unfaithfulness of the exile itself, meaning the exile hadn't automatically produced the desired faithfulness in everyone.
And some returnees seem to think the new age had already arrived.
Exactly. Many seemingly held what scholars call a realized eschatology. They believed the promised new age had already begun with their return.
So maybe rules like strict endogamy, marrying only within the group, weren't quite as crucial anymore.
That seems to be the implication. They accepted the Israelite status of the other Yahwists in the land, including, presumably, groups related to the Samaritans or others who had remained. They were more inclusive.
But Nehemiah,
Yeah.
he had a very different view.
Oh, completely. He saw his opponents, people like Tobiah and Sanballat, who were Yahweh worshippers, and saw themselves as Israelites, as false Israelites. For Nehemiah, their opposition to rebuilding Jerusalem wasn't just political maneuvering. It was opposition to Israel itself, which he believed must be unified under Jerusalem's authority.
So the book leaves you feeling like the job isn't done.
Exactly. The book strongly implies the full restoration of the northern tribes has not yet taken place. So even after the return, the debate over who truly was Israel and what restoration looked like was still incredibly intense.
Okay, so how did Jews living outside the land and the diaspora fit into all this? How did they see their situation?
Well, we see different perspectives. Philo, a major Hellenistic Jewish writer in Egypt, he used the Greek term apoikia,
Meaning colonists.
right, rather than phouye, which means exile or punishment. This suggests a remarkably positive view, seeing Jews abroad as proactive colonists spreading out.
He linked this to the Abrahamic promise,
Yeah.
like God promised Abraham descendants spread across the earth.
Exactly. He highlighted their patriotism to their local homelands, but stressed they still saw Jerusalem as their central capital, their metropolis. It's a vision of a thriving, global Jewish presence, not just a scattered, suffering one.
But Josephus, he had a slightly different take, more focus on eschatology.
Yeah, in his later work, The Antiquities, Josephus develops a more robust view of the end times. He portrays the diaspora not a positive thing, but a punishment, a chastening of the people.
Okay, so more negative.
But, and this is crucial, he argues this punishment actually has the effect of laying the groundwork for the future dominion of the people. God, in this view, uses a negative, the scattering, to produce the ultimate positive result. Israel inheriting not just the land, but dominion over the whole world.
Wow, that's quite a theological interpretation, connecting it to prophecies.
Right. Like Balaam's prophecy or Daniel's vision of the dreamstone that grows to fill the whole world. It reframes diaspora from pure tragedy to part of a grand divine plan.
But in his earlier work, The Jewish War, he sounds different.
A bit, yes. There, he describes the dispersion as a delicate and dangerous situation, and he uses the story of Esther to show God's faithfulness in spite of captivity, not suggesting captivity itself is good. So you see a nuance, maybe a development in his thought over time.
And the fact that there weren't huge mass returns to Jerusalem from the diaspora before 70 CE, that doesn't mean they gave up hope.
Not necessarily. The argument is that it suggests a conviction that the time of restoration had not yet come. Prophets like Jeremiah, remember, didn't tell people to just pack up and go back whenever they felt like it.
It was something God had to initiate.
Right. And the later diaspora revolt, around 116-117 CE, this huge uprising across the Roman Empire, that certainly suggests this powerful restoration theology was still very much alive and could fuel action.
Okay, shifting focus slightly to the Dead Sea Scrolls community, the Qumran group. How did they see the return from Babylon?
They flat out rejected it as the restoration. Their literature consistently rejects the identification of the return from Babylon as Israel's restoration.
So for them, the exile was still happening.
Exactly. They portrayed the exile of Israel as ongoing. That's why they withdrew themselves to the wilderness, the new Sinai. They saw it as to prepare for the coming of God.
And they had this idea of a new covenant.
Yes, a new covenant theology.
Yeah.
They believed they were entering the true, renewed pact with God. And in their view, even native-born Israelites must be initiated into the covenant of the Yad, their specific community, to actually participate in the final eschatological restoration.
So they excluded most other Jews.
Pretty much. They viewed the rest of Israel as still under the curses of the broken covenant. Their texts even talk about cruel Israelites in the house of Judah and wicked Israelites who opposed them.
So not everyone who was ethnically Israelite was part of their true Israel.
Precisely. They make it clear. Israel's redemption does not require the redemption of every Israelite. Identity was so contested that even within Israel, they saw many others as the other, outside the true covenant.
Looking at some other later texts, Tobit, set during the Assyrian captivity.
Right, a book from what scholars call popular Judaism. It uses Israel to distinguish northern Israelites, like Tobit, from southern kin. And Tobit's prayer beautifully reverses the exile narrative.
How so?
He foresees Jerusalem rebuilt with gold and precious stones and prays that a remnant of my descendants should survive to see Jerusalem's glory. It's filled with restoration hope.
And for Ezra, written after the temple was destroyed in 70 CE.
A very powerful apocalypse. It presents a vision of a future messianic restoration of Israel that supersedes the incomplete restoration of Judah from Babylon.
And it focuses on the northern tribes.
Special emphasis, yes, on their miraculous return. In this vision, they'd gone off to a more distant region where mankind race had never lived, specifically to keep God's statutes faithfully.
And God would bring them back.
Yes. The text says the Most High will again stop the channels of the river for their return, clearly echoing the miracle of the Exodus. It's a vision of a grand future ingathering.
What about the testaments of the 12 patriarchs?
Even though they have some later Christian editing, they continue these core patterns, emphasizing the separation of North and South, but looking forward eagerly to the future reunification and restoration of all 12 tribes.
Even someone like Ben Sira, who recognized Nehemiah's importance.
Right. He saw Nehemiah's work, that initial return and rebuilding, as just an intermediate step. It wasn't the ultimate fulfillment of God's promises. That hope for a complete, fully restored, unified Israel remained a powerful, driving theme across so much of this literature.
This brings us to something really fundamental, doesn't it? Something about how identity works, generally.
Yes, a basic fact almost of human existence, that human beings forge their own sense of self only by constructing a sense of the other.
We define ourselves by who we aren't.
In large part, yes. And this is strikingly confirmed in Jewish sources from the Greco-Roman age.
How did ancient Israel generally think about non-Israelites?
Well, broadly speaking, in a bipartite way. Two main categories. There were some non-Israelites considered elect, perhaps part of God's plan in some way, and then others who were non-elect but still seen as full participants in the divine economy, part of the world God created.
And this differs from later Christian views.
Major streams of classical Christianity later departed from this more, let's say, nuanced approach.
Can you give an example from rabbinic traditions?
Sure. There's this recurring story, a midrashic motif, where God offers the Torah, the law, to various nations, but they each refuse it for different reasons.
What does that imply?
It strongly implies the Gentile nation's inability to act righteously, at least according to this tradition. Some rabbinic texts also paint figures like Ishmael and Esau, who represent other nations, in much harsher terms than the biblical text does.
And this all stems from?
It all grows directly out of an affirmation of Israel's special divine election. Defining others, whether positively or negatively, was a way to reinforce their own unique status, their chosenness.
There's also this idea of the original sin of the Canaanites. How is that different from just condemning their idolatry?
Well, most biblical texts focus on idolatry as the reason for their displacement, but the Book of Jubilees, a later text, provides a more fundamental justification.
How?
It explicitly links their fate to their ancestor, Canaan, the son of Ham. Jubilees states that Canaan insisted in settling in a land that did not originally belong to him, land promised to Shem's descendants.
So it was a sin of illegitimate occupation.
Exactly. And later Canaanites, according to Jubilees, committed the same sin as their ancestors simply by being there. It's a powerful narrative tool to define a people as fundamentally other and justify their expulsion or destruction based on ancestry and location, not just actions.
And this othering didn't just apply to outsiders. Communities also defined internal others.
Oh, absolutely. Often as a form of social control or boundary maintenance. Take the Nazirite vow, for example.
That unique vow, no haircuts, no wine, avoiding corpses.
Right. It was a powerful way to express messages about power and holiness. Interestingly, the Book of Numbers opens Nazirism to both men and women.
Which seems progressive, democratizing.
Yes, it radically altering the symbolic web-linking Nazirism, hairiness, and maleness, and in a way, it democratizes and domesticates holy status. Makes it accessible beyond just priests or kings.
But there's a paradox.
Yes. Because even as it seems to open things up, it also tended, in practice, to reinforce a male hereditary status quo. It shows the complex ways social forces work, even within religious practices. It's rarely simple.
What about Ruth? Her foreignness.
Ruth the Moabitess. The author of the Book of Ruth seems to deliberately depict her as someone for whom Hebrew was a second language.
Making her speech slightly off.
Both precise and imprecise, as one scholar puts it. It seems the author exploited what he knew about non-native speakers of Hebrew to underscore the foreignness of Ruth the Moabitess.
So even subtle literary choices reinforce that sense of other.
It seems so. It shows how deeply ingrained the concept was.
We also see this internally with, say, Ben Sira's view of the Samaritans.
Yes, Ben Sira, writing in the Second Temple period, shows clear disdain for Shechem, the main Samaritan center. He uses really harsh terms like foolish foreign nation and doomed nation for other groups too, like the Canaanites. It highlights a very strong sense of in-group versus out-group, even among related peoples worshiping the same God.
This intensity seems amplified in apocalyptic thinking.
Definitely. Apocalyptic thought tends to define the other with a stark binary simplicity.
Meaning black and white. Us versus them.
Exactly. It renders it incompatible with contemporary society, arguably, because it assumes only either one or the other, neither ambiguous, nothing in between, good or evil, light or darkness.
And that rigidity can be problematic.
Well, the argument is this lack of real choice can potentially arrest the full development of the individual. And more disturbingly, this worldview can prompt some to try and hasten the apocalypse through destructive actions.
Seeing destruction as necessary.
Even labeling eschatological devastation as recycling. It's a very rigid and potentially dangerous way of seeing the world, leaving little room for nuance, ambiguity, or coexistence.
And a final way of defining the other was through worship. False versus true.
A absolutely key aspect. The Apocalypse of Abraham, for instance, powerfully explores this. False versus true worship.
How does it illustrate this?
In the story of Abraham's conversion from idolatry, his father Terah's idols dramatically crumble and break, a clear symbol of rejecting false gods.
And God explains this in a vision.
Yes. In a vision, God explains that he allows negative forces, like the figure Azazel who works to destroy humankind through evil, to have power specifically over those who desire evil.
So people get the forces they align with.
That's the idea. The vision also depicts a false Messiah, but importantly contrasts him with a true Messiah. The consequences are stark. Those who mock God face destruction by fire, while the faithful attain heavenly status. The distinction between true and false worship becomes a defining marker of identity, allegiance, and ultimate destiny.
Okay, so pulling all of this together, how did these ancient communities actually engage with the wider world? How did they present themselves?
Well, what's fascinating and really crucial to grasp is that throughout the Second Temple period, the concept of Israel was always theological. It wasn't just an ethnic label.
Why theological?
Because to identify as Israel was inherently a theological claim. It connected back to the idea that YHWH is not the God of the Jews alone, but always the God of Israel.
So using the term Israel carried specific weight.
Yes. Jewish groups, using Israel to refer to themselves, often reflected powerful eschatological, end times, messianic, or political claims about restoration and God's plan.
Which could be exclusionary.
It could be. It meant that while opponents might technically be Jews by descent from Judah, a particular restorationist group may regard these opponents as excluded from Israel in its sense of the people of God due to improper halakhic practices, meaning they didn't follow the religious laws correctly in the group's view. So identity was theological and often contested based on practice and belief.
Now, what's really intriguing is how outsiders, like Greek authors in the Hellenistic period, saw Jews.
Yeah, this is surprising to many. Authors like Theophrastus, Clearchus, Megasthenes, they apparently regarded Jews as a nation of philosophers.
Philosophers? Really?
That's how they're described. People whose concept of divinity involved rational discussions among themselves, a very intellectual portrayal.
And Jewish writers responded to this.
Some did. Aristobulus, a Jewish philosopher writing in Greek, even produced, well, imaginative fabrications, let's call them, that tried to set Greek philosophy into the framework of the Jewish intellectual and religious achievement. claiming Greek thinkers got ideas from Moses, for instance.
And Josephus mentions Pythagoras.
Yeah, Josephus reports a tradition that Pythagoras brought into his philosophy many of the precepts found among the Jews. Whether strictly historical or not, it shows this dynamic intellectual exchange, this claim that Jewish thought was foundational, even respected in the wider world.
Okay, and circling back to internal practices.
Yeah.
Circumcision. When we discuss Antiochus V trying to ban it.
It's absolutely vital to understand that circumcision is part of the ancestral laws of Judaism. It is how one becomes a member of Jewish society.
So it wasn't just a religious ritual in our modern sense.
Not at all. The insight here is that ancient understandings of religion and politics were often completely inseparable. Circumcision was a fundamental marker of belonging to the people, politically, culturally, religiously, all wrapped together. Banning it was an attack on their very existence as a distinct group.
And finally, this blending of traditions. We see it with writers like Artapanus.
Yes. Writers like Artapanus, even if some scholars debate their exact Jewishness, clearly demonstrate this blending.
How so?
Artapanus, for example, retold the Exodus story, but added all sorts of dramatic elements, really enhancing Moses' exploits, making him seem like a Hellenistic hero figure.
And even ordinary Judeans in Egypt.
Even Judeans living in Ptolemaic Egypt, while they certainly used the local Greco-Egyptian common law for everyday things, they still relied on the juridical norms of their Judean ancestry to achieve their litigation goals when it suited them.
So they navigated multiple systems.
Absolutely. The profound takeaway is that these communities were constantly navigating, blending, and balancing multiple identities, legal systems, and cultural influences simultaneously. It wasn't either. It was bohand.
Wow. We have certainly journeyed through some incredibly complex territory today, really intricate historical and conceptual ground.
We really have.
We've seen the evolving, shifting meanings of Israel and Jew. We've seen the powerful ways ancient communities defined themselves, not just by who they were, but so often by who they identified as the other.
Both externally and internally.
Exactly. We uncovered how those shared narratives, those foundational stories, provide such an essential framework for any kind of group discourse.
Yeah, a vocabulary for their world.
And how even incredibly difficult concepts like exile could be reframed, not just as punishment, but maybe as a providential pathway, laying groundwork for future dominion.
It's clear, isn't it? Identity, whether we're talking ancient times or right now, is rarely simple. It's rarely static.
Definitely not.
It's fluid. It's constantly contested. It's perpetually being renegotiated, shaped by history, by language, by beliefs, and crucially, by how groups interact with everyone around them.
So thinking about all this, what stands out to you, listening right now, about how identity gets constructed, both back then and maybe right now?
Yeah, what resonates?
In our world, with this overload of information where terms and labels and self-definitions are constantly shifting, maybe understanding these ancient patterns, this history of contested identity, can offer some surprising insights into our own present moment.
That's a great point. How do the stories we tell ourselves today?
And the ways we define us versus them?
Yeah.
How do those things continue to shape our world right now? Something to think about.